My name is Emily Wilson. I've just turned 18, and I used to live in a large house on the outskirts of Lexington, Kentucky with my parents. We never knew hardship. Dad owned a small but profitable construction company, and Mom worked as a literature teacher at the local school. The upbringing I received could be called ideal. Mom always said that true beauty lies in simplicity, and Dad assured me that courage and perseverance can overcome any obstacle. Our house stood on a spacious street surrounded by old oaks. In the evenings, sitting on the porch, we listened to the sounds of the forest and admired the sunsets. I thought it would always be this way. But one day, when the sky was covered with gray clouds and the first raindrops began to tap on the roof, everything changed. It started with a phone call that shattered the usual silence of our home. I was in the kitchen with Mom, helping her prepare dinner, when Dad's voice cut through the room. It was strangely trembling, almost broken, something I had never heard before. "We've lost everything," he said with difficulty. "The company. It's bankrupt. We'll have to sell the house." Mom's gaze froze, her hand with the knife stopped over the cutting board. I didn't immediately understand what those words meant. Sell the house? But how? This was our home, our sanctuary. It seemed like the walls surrounding us suddenly became fragile, ready to collapse at the slightest touch. Dad told us to pack our things. We had to move to his father's, my grandfather's, old house in the countryside. We had no choice. Everything we loved had to be left behind. The next morning we left Lexington. Dad had left early, saying he needed to settle some affairs, leaving Mom and me alone. As we drove down the highway, I looked out the window at the buildings that became smaller and older. The road wound deeper and deeper into the forests. Mom seemed to be holding up, but I saw her fingers gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. When we arrived at the old house, it looked just as I remembered it from childhood. Large, gray, with peeling paint on the shutters and a garden that no one had tended to for a long time. Suddenly, Grandpa appeared on the porch. He stood in the shadow, hunched and silent, but when we got out of the car, his face lit up with a smile. "Emily," he said, spreading his arms wide. "How grown up you've become." His voice was soft, but I noticed something in his eyes that wasn't there before. Something deep, almost imperceptible. Grandpa led us inside. The house was modest and simple. The floors creaked underfoot, and the furniture looked like it had been there for decades. Nevertheless, Grandpa had made an effort. Our room was clean, and neatly folded blankets lay on the beds. "This won't be for long," Mom said, seeing my doubt. "Dad will sort everything out soon, and we'll go back home." I tried to smile, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Why did Grandpa's gaze linger on me? Why did his smile seem too strained? The first days passed quietly. Grandpa was caring and attentive. He told stories about the past, helped Mom around the house, and even tried to plant new flowers in the garden. But with each passing day, I noticed his intense gaze more and more. He looked at me for too long, as if studying me. Sometimes I caught his reflection in the mirror when I was brushing my hair. These gazes gave me no peace. And although I told myself that maybe it was just my imagination, the feeling of anxiety grew with each day. Days went by as usual, but in our new home I couldn't find peace. Grandpa was welcoming, and sometimes even overly caring. He brought me tea when I sat with my books, offered to tell stories from his childhood. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but there was something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Every morning I went out to the porch to breathe in the fresh air. In those moments when the sun was just rising over the trees, the house didn't seem so gloomy. But even then I couldn't shake the strange feeling that someone was watching me. Sometimes, glancing casually at the window, I caught Grandpa's silhouette standing there, watching me. They no longer held the tenderness I remembered from childhood. Mom often went to the city to help Dad sort out the affairs. On those days, Grandpa and I were left alone. He always found a reason to be nearby. If I sat in the garden reading a book, he would appear with fruit or just sit nearby. We talked, but his words began to disturb me more and more. "You've become so beautiful, Emily," he said one day, placing a plate of neatly sliced apples and peaches on the table. "You remind me of your mother when she was young. But there's something in you. Something unique." I tried to smile, but his words struck me. There was a strange tenderness in Grandpa's voice that made me feel uncomfortable. "Thank you, Grandpa," I replied, trying to change the subject. "And are these apples from the garden? They're always so delicious." "Yes," he nodded, continuing to look at me. "I'm glad you're here. You brighten up this house." His gaze lingered on me longer than it should have. I felt my heart beat faster. There was something inappropriate, almost imperceptible, but I couldn't ignore it. In the evening, when Mom returned, I couldn't help but try to tell her about my feelings. We sat in the kitchen, where a single lamp filled the room with warmth. "Mom," I began, choosing my words, "don't you think Grandpa is acting strangely?" She looked up at me with a tired gaze, paused for a second, and smiled. "Strangely? Emily, you're just not used to it. He's a lonely person, and maybe he wants attention. But I hesitated. How do I say what I feel? Sometimes he looks at me, and it makes me uncomfortable. Mom frowned but then brushed off my words. "Emily, you're too imaginative. He's just your grandfather. He loves you, and it's hard for him to see how grown up you've become. To him, you're still that little girl he used to carry in his arms." I nodded, but inside I still felt that she was wrong. My anxiety was real. The next day, Mom went to the city again, leaving us alone. Grandpa suggested I help him in the garden, and I agreed to keep myself busy. As we cleared dry leaves and weeds, he told me about his childhood, about this house, about how he grew the trees that now almost flooded the garden. "I remember when you used to run around here as a little girl," he said, suddenly stopping. "You were so lively, so carefree. And now you've become someone completely different." "Time changes us all," I replied, not looking up. But he kept looking at me. I could feel it. His gaze seemed to pierce right through me. "You've become beautiful, Emily. I see in you the same grace that your grandmother had. She was a rare woman, you know." His words made me tense. I glanced at him quickly, trying to understand what he meant. But his face was calm, almost pensive. I felt a chill run down my spine. In the evening, I sat in my room trying to distract myself, but thoughts of Grandpa wouldn't leave me alone. In the mirror, I saw my reflection. Long hair, the face that he praised so insistently. Maybe Mom is right. Maybe it's just my imagination. But when I looked out the window, I saw him. He was standing below in the garden, looking straight at my window. The moonlight illuminated his face, and there was something in his eyes that made me freeze. It was more than just the gaze of a relative. There was something deeper, something I was afraid to understand. I stepped back from the window, feeling a shiver run down my spine. That night I couldn't sleep. All I saw before me were his eyes, too deep, too intense. The next morning began as usual. Mom went to the city on business, leaving Grandpa and me alone. The sunlight filtered through the gray haze of clouds, making the light in the room soft, almost muted. I decided to spend the day in the garden. This place always seemed peaceful to me. Old trees, overgrown paths, and the scent of flowers. But today I felt a growing unease. I sat under one of the trees with a book in my hands, trying to immerse myself in the text, but the words slipped away like sand through my fingers. The constant feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me alone. I looked up and scanned the area. No one was around. Only the gentle breeze rustled the leaves. "Emily." Grandpa's voice sounded so suddenly that I jumped. He stood a few steps away from me, holding a plate of fruit. His smile was wide, but there was a wariness, an almost imperceptible tension in it. "I thought you might want a snack," he said, sitting down on the grass next to me. "Thanks, Grandpa," I replied, taking the plate. We sat in silence. I tried to focus on the book, but his presence wouldn't let me rest. He didn't take his eyes off me, and it made me tense up inside. I ate a piece of apple, trying not to look in his direction, but he started talking, breaking the tense silence. "You know, Emily," he began, his voice soft but strangely serious, "I think a lot lately about how time has changed us all. You especially." "Yes, I've noticed." I tried to respond, hoping to turn the conversation into a joke, but he didn't smile. His eyes became serious, almost heavy. I felt a chill run down my spine. You're not ordinary, you know, he continued. You're not just beautiful. There's something about you that makes people stop and look. I tensed, my fingers clutching the book. These words were not what a grandfather should say to his granddaughter. I felt a lump form in my throat. Thank you, Grandpa, I said, trying to keep a neutral tone. But you're praising me too much. I'm just ordinary. No, not ordinary. His voice grew softer, but there was an insistence in it. You don't understand. You're too modest. When I look at you, I don't see just a granddaughter. I see a woman who could outshine anyone. I froze. His words sounded like he wanted to say something I was afraid to hear. My thoughts raced, but I couldn't find what to say in response. The only thing I could do was look away to avoid meeting his eyes. You know, he continued, his voice almost a whisper, I've never seen such beauty. Even your grandmother. She was a beautiful woman, but you surpass her. I felt my heart skip a beat. His words sounded more and more personal, more and more wrong. I stood up, holding the book in my hands, and took a step back. I need to go back to the house, I said, trying to sound calm, though my heart was pounding wildly. Mom might call. Emily, wait. He stood up with me, his voice soft, almost pleading. I know this might be hard for you to understand, but you need to know that you're unique. I just want you to know that. His words sounded like a confession I didn't want to hear. I turned and hurried to the house, feeling his gaze piercing my back. When I closed the door behind me, I finally breathed a sigh of relief. But that wasn't the end. Later that day, as I sat in my room, I heard a soft knock at the door. I froze, not knowing whether to open it or not. Then the door slowly opened and Grandpa peeked inside. I didn't mean to scare you, he said. You need to understand, I just admire you. Nothing bad. Just, I like seeing you. His words sounded calm, but I couldn't ignore the shiver that ran through me. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, hoping he would leave. He lingered for another moment and then closed the door. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. But inside I knew. This wasn't my imagination. Something was changing and I didn't know how to stop it. The next morning the house seemed eerily quiet. Mom had gone to the city again, and Grandpa and I were left alone. I felt uneasy from the start. Even the familiar sounds of the old house, the creaking of the floorboards, the soft tapping of the wind against the windows, seemed threatening to me today. Everything indicated that something was about to happen. To avoid staying inside, I went to the garden again. In this place I could usually find at least the illusion of peace. I sat under a tree, as I had done hundreds of times before, and opened a book. But my thoughts were far from the plot. Grandpa's words, his intense gaze, his overly personal compliments wouldn't leave me alone. They echoed in my head, each time amplifying my anxiety. I heard his footsteps even before he spoke. His presence seemed to displace the air, and I immediately felt my insides tighten. You're always here, he said, his voice soft but strangely deep. This is your place. I didn't respond, just clutched the book in my hands and pretended to read. But he didn't leave. His shadow fell over me and I felt him watching. Emily, he continued, sitting down next to me, we rarely get to be alone. You don't mind if I stay with you, do you? I nodded, not looking at him, though inside everything screamed for me to stand up and leave. But my feet seemed rooted to the ground. He was silent for a while, then spoke again. I often think about how quickly you've grown up. Just yesterday you were a little girl and now you're someone completely different. There's something in you that can't be described in words. His voice was too close, too soft. I felt my breath becoming uneven. I closed the book and stood up. I need to go back, I said, not looking at him. I promised Mom I'd clean the house. But before I could take a step, he grabbed my arm. His fingers were strong, even a bit rough. I froze, feeling my heart beat faster. Wait, his voice was soft, almost pleading. I want to tell you something. I slowly turned to him, trying not to show my fear. His face was closer than ever. I saw every wrinkle, every line on his skin, but there was something else in his eyes. Something that scared me. You don't understand, he continued, his voice trembling. You're more to me. You're my pride, my joy, my dream. These words hit me like a cold wind. I stepped back, but he didn't let go of my arm. Grandpa, I said, trying to make my voice firm. You shouldn't say such things. It's wrong. Wrong? He laughed, but there was no joy in his laughter. Why is it wrong to love? Why is it wrong to admire you? You must understand, Emily. This is more than I can control. I tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened. His other hand reached for my face, but I stepped back, pushing him away with force. No, I exclaimed, feeling tears well up in my eyes. You have no right. I'm your granddaughter, Grandpa. This is just horrible. His face changed. There was pain mixed with confusion in his eyes. He finally let go of me and took a step back. I'm sorry, he whispered, lowering his head. I don't know what came over me. You're so amazing. I wanted you to know how important you are to me. I stepped back a few more paces, not taking my eyes off him. My body was trembling, my heart pounding as if it would burst out of my chest. I'm going, I said quickly, turned and ran to the house, not looking back. When I closed the door behind me, I burst into tears. Tears streamed down my cheeks and I couldn't stop. His words, his gaze, it all felt so wrong, so dirty. I felt like something important had been taken from me. Something I could never get back. A few minutes later, I heard Grandpa knocking on the door, but I didn't answer. Then with a kick, he broke down the door and entered my room. He didn't say a word, but his eyes burned with an animalistic fire, something terrible and primal. He grabbed me by the arms and threw me onto the bed. He sat on top of me and I couldn't escape. He tied my arms to the bed and then tied my legs to different corners of the bed. What followed was horrible. He breathed like a bull, and with aggressive, rough movements he tore off my clothes. I was in horror, trying to scream, but he used a piece of the torn shirt as a gag. He did things to me that I can't even repeat. It was cruel, horrible, and inhuman. It lasted for what felt like hours. In that state I lost track of time, but it felt like an eternity. After he finished all his actions, he silently untied me and left. I was left alone in the room, crying and feeling dirty and empty inside. When Mom returned the next morning, I wanted to tell her everything, but the words stuck in my throat. She was so tired but happy. She said that Dad had almost sorted out the affairs and we would be able to go home soon. Her joy was so infectious that I didn't dare disrupt her peace. I decided I just needed to hold on a little longer. Just a little longer and I would be safe again. But that night would stay with me forever, as a reminder of how close I came to something that should never have happened. With each passing day, my state became more and more tense. I tried to avoid Grandpa, finding excuses to go to my room or go out to the garden when he was home. His presence became unbearable to me. But every time he looked at me, I caught myself thinking that there was no longer the same insistence in his gaze. Instead, there was sadness. His face seemed tired, as if he himself was overwhelmed by everything that had happened. On the third day after that conversation, Mom returned home with news that lifted this burden from me. Emily, she said, smiling broadly, everything is settled. We can go home. These words were like a salvation to me. My heart felt like it would leap out of my chest with relief. I couldn't wait for the moment when we would leave this house, when I would never have to see Grandpa so close again. We began to pack our things. Mom hummed some melody to herself, absorbed in her thoughts, and I was completely focused on leaving as quickly as possible. Grandpa kept to himself, but I felt his gaze every time I passed by. He seemed to want to say something but remained silent. When we left the house with our suitcases, he stood on the porch. His figure, thin and hunched, looked even lonelier than usual. I tried not to look at him, but at some point our gazes met. His eyes were full of deep, almost bottomless sadness. Emily, he called as I passed by. I froze. Mom was already in the car, and I knew I was safe, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of heaviness. Thank you for being here, he said softly. His voice trembled, but there was no longer any hint of the insistence that had once scared me. I I wanted to tell you many things, but maybe it's not important. Just be happy, okay? I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Inside, I felt a mix of relief and strange pity. Despite everything that had happened, he was still my grandfather, the person I once loved and respected. But now there was a chasm between us that could not be bridged. When the car started moving, I felt the tension I had been carrying for weeks beginning to ease. I looked out the window, watching the house and garden disappear in the distance. Grandpa still stood on the porch, his figure growing smaller and smaller until it completely dissolved in the dust of the road. Mom, noticing my silence, turned to me. "Is everything okay, dear?" she asked, her voice soft but concerned. "Yes, Mom," I replied, smiling at her. "Everything will be fine now." She took my hand, squeezed it, and focused on the road again. And I looked at the endless fields stretching along the highway, feeling lighter with each kilometer. Several months passed. We returned to our old home, and life slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Mom and Dad were busy restoring the company, and I went back to school, met with friends, and returned to my usual routine. But sometimes when I was alone, I remembered those days at Grandpa's house. I never told Mom what had happened. Too many questions, too many consequences. But the lesson I took from this stayed with me forever. Family is something important, but even in the closest relationships, there must be boundaries. If someone crosses them, you need to be brave enough to stop it. Now, when I looked in the mirror, I saw myself differently. Not as the girl who was scared and overwhelmed. I saw a young woman who had gone through something difficult, something frightening, but who hadn't let it break her. And when I looked at the sky, I remembered Grandpa's gaze on that last day. His sad, deep eyes. Maybe he regretted it. Maybe he just didn't know how to deal with himself. But it no longer mattered. My heart was free, and I knew I would never let anyone take that away from me again.